Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
I can't wait to chat with our next guest. How exciting is this? Now, I'm going to read you from the Guardian newspaper from last Wednesday, probably last, in fact, it was Friday. There you are. Friday's Guardian. It's only a few days ago. 0-hour contracts banned in New Zealand. 0-hour contracts have been outlawed in New Zealand after Parliament unanimously passed a bill to ban the controversial practice. Political parties across the board supported the ban, which is being hailed as a major victory for minimum wage workers, particularly in the fast food industry. Mike Treen, leader of the Unite Union, who led the charge, said the move was being closely followed by fast food workers worldwide, many of whom banded behind the New Zealand Workers' Campaign last year. It was like we had God sitting on our shoulder helping us out. It just went wild, said Mike Treen. And I'm delighted that Mike himself is on the line to us now live from Auckland in New Zealand. Mike, you're very welcome. How are you?
Hi, Richie. I'm glad we can have this chat.
Well, I'm glad as well, Mike. And I mentioned just before coming on air, huge. We mentioned this, of course, on this programme last week. There was massive interest in this. Obviously, our politics, my politics particularly, are left of centre. I would describe myself as a socialist. I told you I have a union background myself. This is absolutely brilliant. How did you bring this about, Mike? How did you get cross-parliamentary support to ban 0-hour contracts, which are heinous by their very nature? How did you achieve this?
Well, we've got to thank you guys a little bit for that, because we stole the term from the UK. We've been struggling with these type of contracts and employment agreements. We've been struggling with these in the fast food industry for over a decade now. And Unite Union was formed about, although we have the same name as your Unite in the UK, we're a smaller and less well-resourced organisation. So we got going trying to organise casualised workers, fast food workers, cinema workers, security guards, casino workers in New Zealand. A lot of them had been de-unionised in the 90s. So when we got our union going, we wanted to organise these workers, get new collective agreements. Now, we made some progress here. We were getting collective agreements. We were forcing these companies to negotiate agreements, but a big problem that we could never seem to be able to beat was their insistence that they kept absolute control over how many hours you got from week to week. And so last year, all of our fast food agreements expired at the same time. So that's McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, Pizza Hut, Starbucks, Carl's Jr., Wendy's. All of these agreements expired at the end of March, and we knew we were going to have to negotiate them all together. And we thought, well, we're just going to fight like hell to go from sort of completely insecure to guaranteed hours. And then we were looking at it. We're trying, how can we name this beast? How can we name this campaign? And we'd read about the labeling of contracts similar to this in the UK as 0-hour contracts, and we thought, yeah, that's what they are. There's no guarantee. Yes, we have a regular employment agreement, but there's no guarantee. You can go from 0 one week to 40 the next. So it is a 0-hour contract, even if it's a regular employment agreement. You know? And when we named the unnamed, it just took off in the media, in the public's imagination, and I think it's because everyone, I think it was so widespread in New Zealand that almost every family had somebody who was on a contract like this, and the stories that came out and the media frenzy that started to occur was just enormous. So. And so in the end, the fast food companies had to relent and agree to end these contracts, and the government promised to outlaw them. Now, there's a second part to that story, but the government agreeing to outlaw them and was
vital.
rather a special moment as well.
Do us a favour, Mike. Will you give our listeners a flavour of what it is like? What sort of problems does an employee have when they're working on a 0 hours contract? How does that affect your life working on a contract like that?
Well, it just means you've got no rights. That was our problem. These companies know exactly how many hours they want their staff to work from week to week. But what they keep them on with no guaranteed hours, they keep them in that situation so they can control them. So they can reward some who suck up and punish others who may even assert some of their legal rights. So it's a tool, it's a management tool for control, but it's a tool that relies on bullying, relies on this sort of reward and punishment, and more likely punishment for those who don't toe the line. If you call in sick, you know you've lost that shift the next week. If you stand up to the boss and say you want your legally entitled break, lunch break or 15-minute break, you know you're going to lose hours the next week. If you join the union and you're in a McDonald's franchise store, you know you're likely to lose hours the next week. So it made workers' rights extremely difficult to enforce, and often these companies are run by young managers who do not have the experience, maturity, or understanding of how to manage staff properly, and all they can do is bully. So I think a culture of bullying and intimidation was being used rather than.
Do you know what you're describing, Mike? Do you know what you're actually describing there? Obviously, because of my outrageously difficult to understand accent, I'm an Irish boy, right? So I grew up in Ireland, and of course I grew up learning about James Larkin, who of course was an amazing trade union leader in Ireland. In fact, he was born in Liverpool, but his parents were Irish, and he founded the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in Ireland. And what you're describing there are the conditions that Larkin was fighting against. You know, Irish dock workers turning up to work every morning, not knowing whether they'd have any work, where the foreman could tell them to do an about turn and piss off home back to your house. You don't have work today. And because of the power he had, you wanted to keep on his good side, and you'd give him some of your wages, and you know, you might buy him beer in the pub and all of these stories. And that's not too, far removed from what you're describing. No. It's the same thing.
No. And that's exactly what's happened. So, people working unpaid, working beyond that, clocking out at the end of the shift and continuing to work unpaid. Migrants, to a large percentage of the workforce are migrant workers, tied with their contracts often tied to the company that they're working for, so they can't even change employer. And so unpaid work and getting especially the migrant workers to work very long hours as a way of trying to get promotions and so on was rife.
It's terrible, Mike. Needless to say, a lot of tweets coming in. By the way, Zana is in New Zealand. She's a huge fan of yours and is listening to us live in New Zealand just after 10:15 in the morning there, I believe, if my timings are right.
That's right.
Is that right, Mike? Yeah, I think 13 hours in advance of us. Yeah, that's right. Scott was on to say that he's experienced working himself on these 0 hours contracts for 4 years for Jersey Telecoms, working an average of 60 hours a week, says Scott. Scott, you're not telling us whether you're happy or unhappy with it. Let us know. Joanne says, what about all the extra hours these workers do unpaid? These companies need putting in check. Well done, Mike. And as you were tweeting that, Joanne, Mike said that about the extra hours that they'll do to get ahead and not and not get paid for them and all of that. It's absolutely dreadful. Tell us, I mean, Mike, how difficult is it for people not to really lose the rag? Because some of these companies that are screwing over the employees, these are blue chip companies, Mike, and their shareholders and their executives take home, well, let's be honest about it, Mike, they take home unbelievably large pay packets. Don't you start to get almost into a rage when you think about how much is enough for these people? Why would you not want to look after people?
Yes, I know, and some of them are giants like McDonald's. You know, these are a giant corporation, one of the largest employers in New Zealand with about 10,000 staff, just under 10,000 staff. We had the chief executive of restaurant brands, which owns the KFC, Pizza Hut, and Starbucks and Carl's Jr. franchises. He just got $1 million bonus last month for pushing profits up and the share price up. So there's always plenty of money for them, and putting the squeeze on staff and having them work. There always seem to be an element of understaffing is rife in these industries. So they're running around with enormous pressure on them, working their butts off in these companies. And they seem that there is no limit to what they can get away with, except often even the legal limits. Although the legal limits are important, right? So it's important that you can get some legal changes done. And so when the government did promise to outlaw them, we didn't really expect them to follow through on the promise, I must admit, because this is a Tory government. It's maybe not as mean-spirited as your lot, but
can I just come in on that? Can I just come in on that? Because that's a really interesting point, because your Prime Minister at the moment, of course, is John Key. And one of the things about zero-hours contracts, governments love them. This horrendous government that we have here at the moment loves them because they can tell lies about employment figures. They can say that everything is on the up and up, when you and I both know people signing 0 hours contracts, these aren't good jobs with good conditions. Therefore, you shouldn't be claiming that, you've brought in a load of jobs. So how did you bring about cross-parliamentary support, Mike, when, it suits these guys to allow companies operate with 0 hours contracts?
Well, I think one of the things we did is we broadened the definition a little. So in the UK, they try to keep the 0 hour contract definition to people who are sitting at home waiting for a phone call to come into work, right? But I think it's more widespread than that. And so companies in the UK, for example, McDonald's, I will guarantee McDonald's will have no guaranteed hours for their staff from week to week. So they should be labelled a 0 hours employer. Now, we were successful in getting these companies labelled 0 hours employers, and because they are big and profitable companies, because they employ tens of thousands of people, and because they're quite vulnerable, we got a bit of media traction. And there was a combination of things happen. So first of all, the idea got widespread acceptance, and the workers we had lots of events organized where workers could tell their own story. And then negotiations started in March, and there was a very popular 7 p.m. half-hour news show on one of the, we don't have many channels, one of the main TV channels, that the new that the private equity owners were trying to eliminate this news show run by a very fine journalist called John Campbell, and they announced that they're going to close down the Campbell live show on TV3, and hundreds of thousands of people were watching it in solidarity every night, and then John Campbell announced that he was supporting the campaign to end 0 hour contracts and started reporting on our negotiations with the fast food companies. Brilliant. With almost daily updates. And it was just brilliant. And sending workers down to visit the minister in Wellington and trapping them in interviews. And in the end, the minister announces he will outlaw what he termed the worst aspects of the 0 hour contract regime. But the problem they ran into when they came back with a draft that, in a sense, almost legalized them, which is sort of half what you'd expect, right? They came back with a draft law, but they couldn't get a majority in Parliament for their draft law. So some of their coalition partners pulled out of supporting them. So they've only got a narrow majority, and so they refused to support National's draft law. So National was forced at the last minute to go to the opposition parties and ask them for support to get this law through, because they had a bit of a tight deadline on, and the opposition parties and some of the government support parties were able to force changes to the law that actually outlawed it. So in the end, it was a unanimous vote in Parliament, including one right-wing ally of the National Party, a sort of an extreme right neoliberal party called the ACT Party. They only got one MP, but even they voted for it. So it was a bizarre, surreal experience watching this debate, with everybody claiming to be the author of the ending of zero. Every party said that they were the author of the ending of 0-hour contracts. The National Party ended them, the Maori Party ended them, the Labour Party ended them, the Green Party ended them. But actually, it was the campaign by Unite Union.
Of course it was. Well, there's an old saying, isn't there, Mike? Success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. And that's what else would you expect from?
I've been trying to remember that quote.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. Mike Treen is live on the programme, folks, from Auckland in New Zealand. Pleasure to have him on. It's great to be bringing you good news. He heads up the Unite Union from Auckland there. He led the move against 0 hours contracts, which, as he said there, has been backed unanimously by New Zealand, the New Zealand Parliament. There are hundreds of thousands of workers employed on 0 hours contracts in New Zealand at the moment. Their lives are going to change for the better on the 1st of April, which is in a few Fridays, 2 or 3 Fridays time. And this, of course, is important because New Zealand, if I'm right, and I didn't do the research on the population, but I've always known that New Zealand and the Republic of Ireland is about the same, about 4.5 million people, I think, in New Zealand. So when hundreds of thousands of people are on these contracts, that's a huge percentage of the population. The Guardian made reference, of course, to the situation in Britain where, again, huge numbers of people on these contracts. The Guardian singled out Sports Direct, which has 15,000 employees on 0 hours deals here at the moment. Mike, just a quick word before we talk about unions in general, and I've loads of questions for you. And there's a couple of really brilliant emails that have come in asking about, the fears about automation. As automation, becomes more and more sophisticated, and our livelihoods might be, in danger because of automation, and how worried should we be about that, and do we need stronger unions? We'll talk about that in a minute. But how hard did the likes of McDonald's and Starbucks and these big cinema chain companies, how hard did they push back against the banning or the outlawing of 0 hours contracts in terms of lobbying politicians and that? How hard did they fight, Mike?
They fought very hard. We have very uneven strength. It's impossible to impose, almost impossible to legally impose a closed shop on any company in New Zealand lawfully, and so we have complete freedom to join or resign from a union at any time in any workplace. So in these hostile companies and workplaces, it's very hard to sustain a strong presence. So overall, in the fast food companies, we've got probably about 25% union density. So it's difficult to shut them down through strikes and industrial action. Some companies, KFC, we've got probably 60% or more, so we're quite strong there. But McDonald's franchise stores might be 10 or 15%. We'd be lucky, to be that strong. So we have limited ways of putting economic pressure on them. So what we did and what we've done since the beginning, actually, when we first started organizing these fast food companies, we went after the brand. We label them and we run public sort of political campaigns as much as industrial campaigns. So we have strikes and pickets and protests, but we also have concerts in the park, town hall meetings, marches up and down the main street, getting the public on side, getting the media on side as much as possible, and label the owners and the brands that label them as exploiters of young and vulnerable workers, which is what they are actually. And so we look for examples of that, and we told these companies that. So we did get contracts 10 years ago. We got the collective agreements, and we were able to get some wage rises and some union recognition a little bit, but this hours thing, we went to them when we finished negotiations a little over 2 years ago. We told them we're coming back. 2015, we're coming back. So we warned them 2 years in advance. We're coming for you on this issue. Don't pretend that you're surprised when we make this a central issue. And we planned it in detail. We're going to go after these companies. We're going to label them, and we're going to brand them, and we're going to run a public campaign. But it was. The little quote about sort of like in that Guardian article that was I thought was a bit weird, which I actually did say, but it was like having some sort of supernatural power on our backs. Yeah. Everything we touched turned to gold. It was, and it's just that partly it's just the time was right. The old saying, if there's a it's part of the world, I think, that is changing, right? It's the Sanders phenomenon. It's Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. It's people are fed up. People are trying to find ways to say, I'm sick of this inequality, sick of this unequal power, sick of the wealthy having it their way as the only way. Having them write the rules. So we've had, the last few decades with, fairly sort of orthodox. Right-wing economic theory dominating everything, and not a particularly sympathetic legal environment for unions and everything. But I think broad sectors of the population are just sort of fed up with things the way they are, and we were able to tap into that and get such a very broad sympathetic response once people. When they knew what we were saying was true, and they could see the truth in what we were saying. The companies tried to deny they had 0-hour contracts. All we had to do was show the reporters the wording. We will not guarantee you any hours from week to week. So the company said, "Oh, we always give people hours." Well, but the point is, you have the power not to. That's the problem. That's what we needed to break. And I think we're going to be able to build. While we are, the union is morally and politically much stronger now in the industry. We're recruiting more members, so we're going to make more progress in the future as well.
You're incredibly magnetic, though, Mike. I mean, I hear union people on TV here all the time and on radio, and they're not as human and as kind of matey as you are. I obviously researching this.
You're very generous.
Well, I'm sure. Listen, I'm sure you're a shrewd and a hard-nosed negotiator. Of course you are. I'm not saying that for a minute, but watching some interviews with you in preparation, in research for this today, you do have, a real rapport with people. You're a regular bloke, and that's important. Now I'm going to talk about unions and about unions here in a second, but I want to read a few tweets. Mike Treen of the Unite Union in Auckland, New Zealand is on the line to us live. It's 27 and a half minutes to the top of the hour. We've probably got about 15 to 18 minutes more with Mike, Mike permitting, of course. It's great to have him on. Thanks for all the tweets. There are loads of them. Put Richie Allen Show, all one word, no they, just Richie Allen Show into Twitter. You'll see what people are saying. Paul Jackson says, I'm on 0 hours at the moment. I get a day's holiday. 4 out of every 100 hours I work, but with the new contract I get a fixed 20 days, says Paul. Thanks for that, Paul. Martin Noakes has been on to congratulate Mike and everybody who worked to get 0 hours contracts outlawed in New Zealand. Thanks very much for that, Martin. On automation, Wayne was on to say on Twitter, at the end of the day, Richie, they will depopulate once the machines are there to do the work and full automation is achieved. That's a bleak outlook, Wayne, but I understand exactly why it is that you feel that. Mike, I'm going to just talk about something you'll be very much aware of as well, and something we covered at length last summer. Last summer, we learned that the British government, when I say we learned, we knew it was coming. The Business Secretary, Sajid Javid, announced that they were going to look at unions again in this country. And they were going to introduce plans that would criminalise picketing, that would permit employers to hire strike-breaking agency staff. Now, when I came across this last July, Mike, as somebody who studied history, and I know the history of unions in Ireland, trade unions in Ireland, again, this is like going back to the late 1800s. So to criminalise picketing, permit employers to hire strike-breaking agency staff, and basically cut off union funding, and funding coming from unions to the Labour Party. These are plans the Conservative Party had in this country for a long time. I would argue that, even Tony Blair, who I know some of our audience would disagree with this, I would go as far as to say that these are things that would have come in if Blair had another 10 or 12 years in power. What place do unions have today? And do you understand when people get a bit fatigued by unions and people get a bit down in the dumps about them and they get a bit pessimistic about them and they say, well, unions are not what they used to be. They don't have the power that they used to be. In some cases, they've been shown to be corrupt, where delegates and presidents of unions and the directors of unions have been, doing deals behind the backs of the employees they're supposed to be working for. I'm a big union guy, like I said, Mike, and I do believe that, thank God for your story, by the way, but in this country and in Ireland, people they're not fed up with unions, but they don't believe in unions the way they used to. They don't believe that unions are going to work for them the way they used to. What do you think of that?
That's a problem, but it's probably to be honest, it's a problem that that many unions have created, and because they've failed to adequately represent their members and strongly enough, and have bent over too often to the employer. So people did and have lost confidence in unions. Now we went through an awful period in New Zealand in the 1990s, of a decade of very strong anti-union laws that saw union membership collapse, especially in the private sector. So we are now less than 10% union coverage in the private sector in New Zealand. Public sector unions are much stronger, about 30%, but private sector union rates are very low, and tended to be just the sort of the very big companies and very big workplaces. So when we decided to form Unite Union in New Zealand, we decided to try and do it in a new way, a slightly different way, more campaigning style, more using volunteers, going back to the beginnings of unionism, how unions were. We're paid very modestly. We want people working for us who think it's a cause and a privilege to work for a union, not a career move. Half our staff are from our fast food workers and others who have sort of come through the ranks, and the other half are sort of left wingers, who people who are motivated. They want to change the world, and they want a union that's willing to fight to help sort of make that happen. And I think it's a good combination. We were able to bring together that sort of political campaigning and social movement organizing experience, as well as some direct sort of union people who had some a union, sort of more traditional union experience. And there was some resistance from other unions when we got going. We're now a little bit the flavour of the month. We've been going for 10 or 12 years. We've got 7,000 or 8,000 members, which in New Zealand ain't bad for a union in the sectors that we're organising. And as I say, we've got collective agreements with all fast food companies in this country, which it's very rare to have them. And I don't even think you have them in the UK in fast food. I don't think you have collective agreements there. So we've been able to achieve this. Now, there's some things that are, it's important to fight for legal rights. So we have a couple of legal rights that are important and very helpful to us that the government hasn't been able to change. We've got a right of access, to actually enter a workplace and talk to workers, a legal right of access, can't be arrested for doing so. And we've got and of course we've got a right to picket, and we do have a right to strike. The right to strike in your country is much more restricted. We can only do it during contract negotiations period, so they're banned outside of that, which is a bit annoying for us. But we're able to, we have relative freedom, during the contract negotiation period, to take action without too many bureaucratic or legal restrictions. So these are important rights we've got to fight for. We should be trying to where the union remains the last bastion of support. So even if it's a weak union, even if it's a little bit of a corrupt union, workers got a duty to try and use them, really. Make them better. It is possible to improve situations inside unions, rather than walking away from them. Right? I think we've got to have an idea of reforming unions where we can, but also forming new ones where necessary as well.
Mike, while we're talking, this is a bit of amazing synchronicity. As the Independent newspaper is reporting, that the House of Lords has voted against the Conservative Party's plan to force trade union members to opt into paying the political levy, which would have cost the Labour Party around about £8 million a year. That's just happened this evening as we've been talking. The Lords voted by 320 to 172 to basically reject that. That's absolutely great news. Hot on the heels of of me talking about what the government's plans were for unions here. And anybody wants to follow that, it's in the Independent newspaper and in the Guardian newspaper now in the last short time. The government defeated over plans to force union members to opt in to paying political levy. That bill was sent after being passed in Parliament to the Lords, and the Lords said no and sent it back. That's interesting. Very good.
That's very good. No, it's very good. It's important to fight for those rights. Got to extend. You need the right to take action. You need the right to sort of because there's such tremendous inequality unless there's at least a partial rebalancing. People are just going to continue to get ripped off because even these big employers, like you're saying, big employers, they pay barely better than the minimum wage, or if that at all, and so these legal minimums are important too. Yeah.
Can I ask you a couple of quick questions before we leave it? I came across, that the city of Detroit in the United States has been destroyed economically for a number of reasons, which we won't go into here because we don't have time. But one of the things, I saw a couple of interesting documentaries about the city of Detroit some maybe a year ago or less. And there were some interesting companies springing up there, and they were co-op companies where everybody in the company, one was a bakery in particular, where everybody in the company had an equal share in the company and the success of it, including the CEO, because they had a CEO and they had a manager and they had people doing various things in the bakery. I think there was about 40 people employed, but they were all in it together and they all earned, a decent living out of it. And the profits were shared amongst them all equally, which I thought was very interesting. And that's an interesting thing. And maybe that goes hand in hand with some of the questions I've been asked to put to you about companies whom might destroy people's livelihoods as automation becomes more and more sophisticated and we lose our jobs and our livelihoods to machinery. One or two people saying, well, what about people getting together to say, well, we can make those products ourselves together in the community and form companies that are co-ops. What do you think of those ideas, Mike? Automation, first of all, the problems it's going to create for unions like yours, but the solutions then to automation, forcing people out of the workplace. What do you think?
I think we've got a big challenge with the automation that's coming, right? Automation, It is in the nature of capitalism to improve productivity, displace labor, and replace it with machines. They've been doing it for 200 years. And in fact, a measure of the health of a capitalist economy is improving productivity, and productivity is the displacement of labor by machinery. In the final analysis, right, improved productivity means you're producing more than before. But I think there is a particular danger with some of the technology that is happening at the moment that we need creative thinking about, and that's the labor sharing apps like Uber and so on, where it's organizing labor and trying to turn labor into a self-employed contractor or something, and often below the minimum wage and so on. But there are also ways of challenging that, of organizing those workers collectively and allowing them to do so. They're looking at that in Seattle. California's passed laws to say that they're not self-employed contractors, they're workers with the rights of workers. You can also insert an algorithm into the programs that they use that guarantees them that they get at least the minimum wage. So there are technical and political and collective ways of sort of protecting workers' rights with this changing in technology, because they will use the changing technology to try to undermine workers' rights and workers' organization. And we need a smart way of meeting that challenge.
We certainly do.
Before we go, though, Richie, I just wanted, before I forget.
There is one question, though, just before you forget. Let me just ask you this last question, and then you can have the final word, and then we'll wrap it up, because we're running out of time anyway. Yep. But Zana, who's listening in New Zealand, wants to know if you have extra hope for New Zealand workers now that the ex-union lawyer Andrew Little is the leader of the Labour Party. What do you think?
I do have more hope that the ideas that are coming out of the Labour Party are going to be more creative. He is a more creative and he is a thinker. He's not exactly your charismatic sort of type, right? So he's not going to make a big impact personality-wise, but he can. If they work the policy stuff seriously, then they can do it. Just recently, they can make it better. Labour is struggling a bit in the polls. They're sitting on about 30%. The Greens are on about 10%. So it's still a bit of a struggle to try and defeat this government. This government remains reasonably popular. In part, this government, because it's quite smart, it tries to present itself as a moderate sort of Tory government. So they, for instance, they ban the 0 hours. So it's a struggle for Labour to be able to differentiate itself from them. One interesting idea that they have floated and saying that they will, because they seem to be able to look at some new ideas in a creative ways, and even some quite radical ideas, is they're looking at a universal basic income as a policy option in the face of this new technology that we're talking about. So that's quite a radical idea, and I think is a very useful one to protect workers in the face of the changes that capitalism has in store for us over the next few years.
Interesting, the living wage.
So he's not. So yeah, I think there's a chance it will make a difference. I'm not convinced yet.
Right, now you have the final word. There was something you wanted to add, so I'll let you do that, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah,
they're going to be turning up there very shortly. One of my organisers, another Irish fella like yourself, and I were having planned a little bit of a holiday in Ireland because of the anniversary of 1916. That's and right. So on. There were events just happening there in April and May. So we planned a bit of an annual leave trip to Ireland. But it's turned into a bit of a working holiday for both of us. He was heavily involved in the fast food campaign. So unions in Ireland and the UK are keen to hear us talk a little bit about that. So in late April, early May, we may be in Ireland and in London with some events where people may be able to come along and have a talk in person. So that might
Well,
be
that's brilliant. And if anybody is listening to this in Manchester and you work for a union and you're interested in chatting to Mike, we'll put you in touch with him. We've had teachers' unions and other unions on this programme. Thanks for taking the time out, my friend. I'm sure you got a busy day ahead of you. Enjoyed chatting with you. What a fantastic result for you and everybody who worked with you. A real win for the little guy, and I really mean that. I think you're marvellous. Look after yourself, and I hope to talk to you again in the future.
Cheers, Richie.
Bye for now. Mike Treen, the Unite leader, the leader of the Unite Union in New Zealand, on the line to us there from Auckland. And well done to Claire Calvi for chasing that story down and getting him on, because it's good news and it shows what can be done. You know, it's really important. I guarantee you the hundreds of thousands of people in New Zealand who are living on 0 hours contracts, they're a lot better off. They're a lot better off psychologically than they were before that happened. So great for him. Now, Colin is listening in Spain. Richie, having lived in Spain, you must be aware of the practice of an employer taking on an employee at the basic rate or the basic wage. And then the employer has to pay insurance for that person. He then says that the employee has to work every day or hours not contracted for, and he will pay the employee under the counter, so no tax or insurance is recorded or paid for that extra time. Colin, that's right, Colin. That's absolutely right. Now, I didn't experience that personally myself in Spain, but I know plenty of people who did. Thanks very much for your email. And thanks for all the emails that came in during that. Wonderful to hear that good news story.